We think of history as a line of kings and queens, a ledger of battles won and lost. We see it in the polished marble of monuments, in the gilded frames of portraits that hang in silent, temperature-controlled galleries. We have tamed it, catalogued it, placed it behind velvet ropes. We believe we understand the forces that shape our world. We build our cities from steel and glass, fortresses of concrete reaching for a placid sky, and we tell ourselves they are permanent. We believe we have conquered the old fears, the elemental furies. We believe we are safe. This is a comforting illusion. The truth is that civilization is a thin, fragile crust over a core of chaos. It is a flickering candle in an infinite darkness, and the wind is always rising. The forces that built our world are the same that can unmake it in a single night. And the greatest of these, the most ancient and intimate of our terrors, is fire. Not the tamed flame in the hearth or the controlled burn of an engine. But the other fire. The hungry fire. The fire that thinks. The fire that remembers every slight, every moment of arrogance, every instance of our hubris, and waits, patiently, for its moment to remind us of who is truly in control. You think you know the story of the Great Fire of London. You've seen the engravings, the dramatic paintings of a red-streaked sky. It's a distant event, a chapter in a textbook. A tragedy, yes, but a quaint one, belonging to a world of wooden houses and men in wigs. But you don't know the heat. You don't know the sound. You don't know the smell of a burning city, the taste of its ashes on your tongue. You don't know the feeling of the ground trembling as a cathedral built to last 1,000 years collapses into its own crypt. You have not stood on the banks of the Thames and watched the river boil. So I need you to do something for me. I need you to forget the city you know. Forget the underground, the black cabs, the electric hum. Forget the polished stone and the plate glass. We are going somewhere else entirely. We are going into the dark. Put your phone face down. Turn the volume to a whisper. Let's go in. The city that summer was a tinderbox dreaming of a spark. London in 1666 was not a city of stone, not yet. It was a city of wood, a sprawling, organic labyrinth of half-timbered houses leaning against one another for support, their upper stories jutting out over the narrow, winding lanes until neighbors on opposite sides could almost shake hands from their bedroom windows. It was a medieval city straining at its Roman seams, a place of 10,000 gables and eaves, of exposed beams coated in layers of flammable pitch, of thatched roofs dry as bone. It was a forest, felled and reassembled, waiting for a single, careless ember to return it to its elemental state. The very air was thick with the promise of combustion. It smelled of coal smoke, of sawdust from the carpenter's yards, of tar from the shipwrights down by the river, of baking bread and roasting meat, all layered over the pervasive, inescapable stench of human and animal waste that festered in the open drains and cesspits. This was the perfume of the 17th century, a rich, volatile potpourri of life and decay. For months, an unrelenting drought had held the capital in its grip. The long, hot summer had baked the moisture from everything. The wooden walls of the houses were desiccated, the pitch that sealed their timbers was brittle and cracked. The thatch on the roofs of the poorer dwellings was like straw in a barn, and the hay and fodder stored in the stables and inns that dotted the city were dangerously dry. Even the thick oak beams, the very bones of the metropolis, had surrendered their deep-held dampness. The New River, the city's main water supply, had dwindled to a sluggish trickle. The wooden water pipes that ran beneath the streets were often empty, their elmwood conduits shrinking and warping in the dry earth. The public water wheels, like the great one at London Bridge, turned slowly, laboriously, struggling to lift the meager offerings of the low-riding Thames. The city was thirsty. It was a patient pyre, meticulously prepared by a season of sun. And then there was the wind. A persistent, nagging easterly had been blowing for over a week. It was not a gale, not yet, but a steady, determined pressure, a dry, warm breath that hurried through the cramped alleyways and whistled under the eaves. It was a bellows, aimed at the heart of the city. For the men of the London fire brigades, the men who worked the primitive manual pumps and leather buckets, this wind was a source of constant, low-grade anxiety. They knew what it meant. They knew that any small blaze, any chimney fire or overturned candle, would not be easily contained. The wind would give it legs. It would give it wings. It would turn a spark into an incident into an inferno. They watched the weathercocks atop the church spires, all pointing west, and they felt a familiar dread settle in their bones. They were custodians of a city built to burn, in a season made for burning, with a wind sent to fan the flames. London in 1666 was also a city of ghosts and anxieties. The Great Plague of the previous year was a wound that had not yet scarred over. It had scythed through the population, leaving over 100,000 dead, a quarter of the city's inhabitants. The memory was raw, visceral. The plague pits were still settling. The red crosses painted on doors had been covered with fresh paint, but they remained visible in the mind's eye. People had returned to the capital, life had resumed its frantic, commercial pace, but there was a brittleness to it, a collective trauma that hung just beneath the surface. They had survived a visitation from God, a divine punishment. They had faced the apocalypse and, for a time, had been spared. This sense of a recent, narrow escape bred a strange mixture of fatalism and a desperate desire for normality. Prophecies and portents were everywhere. Almanacs were consulted with religious fervor. The end of the world was a common topic of conversation, not as an abstraction, but as a recent, tangible possibility. The year itself, with its triple sixes, was a source of deep, superstitious unease for a populace steeped in biblical interpretation. They were living in apocalyptic times, and they knew it. The political air was just as charged. The restoration of King Charles II was only 6 years old. The deep, bloody fissures of the Civil War were papered over, not healed. Old loyalties and resentment simmered. The court was a place of lavishness and license, a stark contrast to the Puritan austerity it had replaced, and this bred a moral unease in many. England was also at war with the Dutch, a bitter naval conflict that drained the treasury and fueled a constant, paranoid xenophobia. Foreigners, particularly the French and Dutch, were viewed with suspicion, seen as potential spies and saboteurs. Rumors of Catholic plots, a perennial English obsession, were rife. The city was a powder keg of social and political tension, a place where fear could catch as quickly as any flame. This was the London that went to sleep on the night of Saturday, September 1st. A city of wood and wind, of recent grief and simmering paranoia. A city holding its breath, unaware that the air it was holding was already turning to smoke. It was a metropolis at the peak of its pre-industrial power, a hub of global trade, a clamorous, vital, and profoundly vulnerable testament to human ambition. And it was already doomed. The materials for its destruction were not just in its walls and roofs, but in its very soul. It began in darkness, in the forgotten heat of a dying fire. The city slept, or tried to. In the close, stuffy rooms of the timber-framed houses, Londoners tossed in the lingering warmth of the day, the dry wind rattling the leaded panes of their windows. The watchman made his rounds, his call of "All's well," a fragile, hopeful lie echoing down the empty, rubbish-strewn lanes. In a small bakery on Pudding Lane, a narrow thoroughfare that ran down towards the Thames, the day's work was done. Thomas Fariner, the king's baker, a man of modest but respectable standing, had overseen the final batch of ship's biscuit for the Royal Navy. He had drawn his fires, as he had done thousands of nights before. He had checked the oven, a cavern of brick and stone set into the heart of his wooden house. He believed it to be safe. A routine chore at the end of a routine day. But in the deep, residual heat of the oven's core, a few embers still glowed with a stubborn, ruby light. They were not dead, merely sleeping. Fariner and his family, his wife, his daughter Hannah, and their maidservant, retired to their beds on the upper floors. Below them, the bakery was silent, save for the creaks and groans of the old timber frame settling in the night. The pile of firewood stacked against the wall next to the oven was dry as dust, seasoned by the long summer. Sometime after midnight, in the deep silence of the sleeping city, one of those embers, perhaps jostled by a draft or simply reaching a critical point of its own slow combustion, found a purchase. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible event. A spark, no bigger than a firefly, leaped from the dying heart of the oven and landed in the kindling. For a moment, it did nothing. It was a single point of incandescent orange in a world of black. But the dry, easterly wind, that relentless presence, was at work even here. It found its way through the cracks in the walls, under the door, a subtle but persistent draft that breathed on the tiny spark. It was a whisper of encouragement. The spark glowed brighter, then caught. A wisp of smoke, thin and pale, curled up from the woodpile. It was the fire's first breath. Slowly, tentatively, the flame grew. It was not yet a fire, but a conspiracy of embers. It licked at the edges of the split logs, tasting the dry wood, finding it to its liking. It was a small, delicate thing, a nascent creature learning the extent of its own power. It crept along the floor, a quiet, spreading stain of light. The smoke thickened, no longer pale but a greasy, acrid gray, carrying the scent of burning pine. It filled the small bakery, clinging to the ceiling, seeping into the sacks of flour, coating the wooden peels and baking troughs with a fine, dark dust. The fire began to speak, a soft crackling sound, the breaking of 1,000 tiny bonds in the wood. It was a sound lost in the larger silence of the night, a secret monologue. As it gained confidence, the flames climbed. They scaled the woodpile and reached the dry, timbered wall of the house. Here, for the first time, the fire found a vertical purchase. It began to ascend. Upstairs, the family slept on, oblivious. The first sign of trouble was the smoke. It was a thief, slipping under the door of the maidservant's room, then into the chambers where Fariner and his family lay. It was a choking, insidious presence that invaded their dreams before it woke them. The maidservant was the first to stir, coughing, her eyes stinging. She opened them to a world made of shadow and a thick, rolling haze. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. Her screams were the first alarm, a human sound in a world that was now dominated by the growing roar from below. The Fariner family awoke to a nightmare. The floor beneath their feet was already hot. The staircase, their only way down, was a column of smoke, its wooden treads already licked by the vanguard of the flames. Escape that way was impossible. The fire was no longer a small, creeping thing. It was a furnace, and the house was its fuel. The old wood, the pitch, the dry timbers, everything that had made their home was now conspiring in its destruction. Fariner, his wife, and his daughter Hannah knew the terror of the trapped. The fire was below them, the street was a world away. Their only hope was an upstairs window. They scrambled to it, threw open the casement, and looked out into the narrow confines of Pudding Lane. The night was no longer dark. It was lit by a hellish, flickering orange from their own home. From their window, they could just reach the gutter of the house next door. One by one, they clambered out, inching their way across the tiles, their nightclothes illuminated by the fire that was now bursting from the windows below them. They made it, tumbling through the window of their neighbor's house, gasping, soot-stained, and terrified. But the maidservant, paralyzed by fear, did not follow. She remained at the window, framed against the inferno, and was consumed. She became the fire's first recorded victim, a life extinguished in the first hour of a catastrophe that would devour a city. Down in the lane, the first few roused neighbors were gathering, their faces upturned, mouths agape, watching in disbelief as the baker's house was transformed into a raging torch, its flames already reaching out, hungry, for the houses on either side. The fire, born in a forgotten ember, had come of age. It was no longer contained. It was free. In the first hours of Sunday morning, the fire was still a local affair, a spectacle of horror for the residents of Pudding Lane and its immediate environs. It was a terrible misfortune for the Fariners, a shocking disturbance for their neighbors, but it was not yet the Great Fire. It was one of 100 small blazes the city suffered in a year, albeit a particularly fierce one. This underestimation, this failure of imagination, would be the city's undoing. The initial response was clumsy and heartbreakingly inadequate. The parish constables arrived, sleepy and bewildered, followed by citizens armed with the standard tools of 17th-century firefighting, leather buckets, small hand-cranked water squirts that were little more than toys against such a blaze, and long poles with hooks on the end, known as fire hooks, intended to pull down burning thatch. They formed bucket brigades, passing containers of water hand to hand from the few available public pumps and cisterns. But it was a futile gesture. The water they threw onto the base of the fire evaporated into steam long before it could touch the heart of the flames. The heat was already too intense. It drove them back, their faces scorched, their eyes streaming. The fire, meanwhile, was not merely burning, it was breeding. Fanned by the relentless easterly wind, it leaped from Farriner's bakery to the adjoining houses with terrifying speed. The narrowness of the lane acted as a flue, channeling the wind and the heat. The overhanging upper stories, so characteristic of London architecture, became bridges of flame. Within an hour, the fire had consumed the entire row of houses on the east side of Pudding Lane. It had also reached the yard of the Star Inn at Fish Street Hill, where it found a treasure trove of fuel, stables filled with hay and straw. The inn went up with a great whoosh, a column of fire and sparks ascending into the night sky, a beacon of disaster now visible across the city. These sparks, carried on the wind, became emissaries of the fire, landing on the dry roofs and in the clogged gutters of houses hundreds of feet away, starting new, independent blazes. The fire was beginning to metastasize. The Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was woken and brought to the scene. His reaction would become infamous, a symbol of the catastrophic failure of civic leadership. Bloodworth was a merchant, not a statesman, a man whose authority was derived from commerce, not crisis management. Faced with the growing inferno, he was paralyzed by a combination of arrogance, incompetence, and a petty concern for property rights. The standard, and only effective, procedure for containing a major fire in such a city was to create a firebreak, to demolish the houses in the fire's path, starving it of fuel. But this required decisive action and the authority to destroy private property. When urged to give the order, Bloodworth dithered. He worried about who would pay for the destroyed homes. He looked at the blaze, which by now had a ferocious hold on several streets, and dismissed it with a contemptuous wave. Pish, he is reported to have said, a woman might piss it out. With that, he refused to authorize the demolitions and went back to bed. It was a decision of such monumental ineptitude that it sealed the city's fate. His abdication of responsibility left a vacuum of command at the most critical moment. With the Lord Mayor absent and the local efforts proving useless, the fire was left to its own devices. And its device was conquest. By dawn on Sunday, it was no longer a collection of individual house fires, it had coalesced into a single, monstrous entity, a rolling wall of flames several hundred yards wide. It was moving downhill, towards the river, and west, into the heart of the city. It consumed Thames Street, a street of warehouses and wharves packed with the combustible wealth of empire. Barrels of oil, casks of brandy, tons of coal, stacks of timber, bales of cloth, stores of pitch, tar, and tallow, all the raw materials of trade became nothing more than high-grade fuel. The warehouses exploded in succession, sending fireballs and flaming debris erupting into the sky. The fire had found an almost limitless source of energy, and it gorged itself. The sound was now a continuous, deafening roar, a sound like a stormy sea, punctuated by the crack of splitting beams and the crash of collapsing roofs. The sky over the eastern part of the city was no longer black, but a terrifying, lurid orange, a false dawn that promised not a new day, but the end of the world as they knew it. The smoke, thick and black and greasy, billowed westwards, a vast funeral pall that began to stretch over the sleeping, unsuspecting heart of the capital. The first 24 hours were a story of a small mistake, a fatal wind, and a catastrophic failure of leadership. The fire was now an army, and it was marching on London. As Sunday morning bled into a smoke-choked afternoon, the abstract horror of a distant fire curdled into immediate, personal terror for tens of thousands of Londoners. The illusion of safety, the belief that the fire was someone else's problem, evaporated in the face of the encroaching heat and the blizzard of hot ash. The primary instinct, ancient and overwhelming, took hold: flight. What began as a trickle of worried families leaving the streets closest to the blaze soon swelled into a torrent, then a flood, a chaotic, desperate mass exodus of a populace that had suddenly realized their city was being eaten alive. The narrow streets, already an impediment to firefighting, now became channels of human misery. They were choked with a frantic tide of people and possessions, a river of desperation flowing away from the ever-advancing roar of the fire. The scene was one of almost biblical pandemonium. Families pushed and shoved, their faces slick with sweat and grime, their eyes wide with panic. Men strained to push handcarts piled high with a pathetic miscellany of salvaged belongings, a bed frame, a few pewter plates, a heavy wooden chest, a crying child perched precariously on top. Women clutched infants to their chests, dragging older children by the hand, their calls and cries lost in the general din. The old and the infirm were carried on the backs of the strong or simply abandoned in the crush. The social contract, the thin veneer of neighborly civility, was dissolving in the heat. It was every man, every family, for themselves. The air was a choking soup of smoke, ash, and the dust of pulverized plaster. The noise was a symphony from hell, the ceaseless, hungry roar of the fire, the crash of falling buildings, the splintering of timber, and layered over it all, the cacophony of human distress, shouts, screams, prayers, and curses. The River Thames, the great artery of the city, became the primary vector of escape. The wharves and stairs leading down to the water were scenes of unimaginable chaos. A desperate multitude swarmed the banks, all trying to secure passage on any vessel that could float. An ugly, Darwinian economy took hold. Boatmen and ferrymen, who days before would have rowed a passenger across the river for a penny, now found themselves masters of the city's fate. They became profiteers of panic, demanding exorbitant, ruinous sums for a place in their overloaded wherries and barges. A lifetime's savings might be offered for a single journey to the relative safety of the Southwark Bank. Fights broke out on the crowded jetties. People were trampled underfoot, pushed into the murky water in the mad scramble for a boat. The river itself became a surreal spectacle. It was clogged with a flotilla of desperation, boats so heavily laden with people and goods that their gunwales were mere inches from the water. The surface of the Thames was covered in a floating debris field of abandoned possessions, charred fragments of wood, and a thick carpet of soot. The water, reflecting the blazing city, seemed to burn, a river of fire mirroring the inferno on its northern bank. From the south side, crowds gathered to watch the destruction of their city, a silent, horrified audience to a tragedy of unimaginable scale. For those who could not afford or reach the boats, the only escape was north and east, through the city gates into the open fields beyond the walls. The main arteries leading out of the city, like Bishopsgate and Aldgate, were as congested as the streets leading to the river. The exodus was slow and agonizing. Carts broke down, their axles snapping under the weight of hastily loaded furniture, blocking the way for the thousands pressing from behind. The city's authorities, so ineffective in fighting the fire, were equally helpless to manage the flight of its people. The guards at the gates could do little but stand aside and watch the river of humanity pour out into the countryside. By nightfall on Sunday, the fields of Moorfields and Finsbury, just outside the city walls, were transformed into vast refugee camps. Thousands of homeless Londoners huddled together in the open, with no food, no water, and no shelter but what they had managed to carry on their backs. They sat in stunned silence, their faces illuminated by the ghastly light of their burning home, watching the pillar of fire that rose from the heart of London. They were the dispossessed, the survivors of a cataclysm that had, in a single day, erased their homes, their livelihoods, and their world. They had escaped the fire, but they were now adrift in a sea of uncertainty, their future as black and unknowable as the smoke-filled sky above them. The great exodus was not just a flight from danger, it was the physical manifestation of the city's unraveling, the dispersal of a community into a scattered collection of terrified individuals. Monday, the 3rd of September, dawned not with light, but with a deeper, more suffocating darkness. The sun was a dim, copper disk, almost completely obscured by the colossal plume of smoke that now blanketed the sky for miles. The fire had burned all through Sunday night, unchecked and unchallenged, and with the new day, it began its assault on the very heart of London's identity, its wealth. Having gorged itself on the flammable goods of the riverside warehouses, the inferno now turned its attention west and north, marching into the financial district, the square mile of streets that constituted the engine room of English and, increasingly, global commerce. This was not just an attack on homes and churches, it was an attack on the abstract, yet immensely powerful, edifice of money and credit that held the kingdom together. The fire was about to burn the ledger books of an empire. The first great bastion to fall was the Royal Exchange, the magnificent bourse founded by Sir Thomas Gresham, the symbolic centre of London's commercial life. It was a grand, arcaded building surrounding an open courtyard, its upper floors filled with shops selling the most luxurious goods from around the world, silks from Persia, spices from the Orient, fine cloth from Flanders. Merchants from a dozen nations gathered here daily to strike deals, arrange shipping, and trade in commodities. It was the physical embodiment of London's mercantile supremacy. On Monday morning, the fire, advancing up Cornhill, laid siege to it. For a time, the stone and brick of its construction seemed to hold. But the fire was patient and insidious. Sparks, carried by the ever-present wind, found their way into the wooden clock tower. Flames licked at the wooden stalls and the goods within the arcades. The heat became so intense that the stone itself began to crack and spall. With a series of thunderous crashes, the great statues of the English kings that adorned its facade toppled into the street. Then the roof fell in, and the Royal Exchange, the pride of the city, was transformed into a hollow, roaring furnace. The destruction was more than material, it was a profound psychological blow. If the Exchange could burn, what could possibly be safe? From the smoldering ruins of the Exchange, the fire swept down Lombard Street, the center of banking and finance. Here were the goldsmiths' shops, the precursors to modern banks, where the city's merchants and the kingdom's gentry deposited their gold and silver for safekeeping. The street was lined with the signs of the great financial names of the day. As the fire advanced, a desperate scramble began. Goldsmiths and their apprentices worked frantically to move their wealth, heavy chests of coin, bullion, and plate, from their cellars into carts or down to the river. But for many, it was too late. The fire moved faster than any cart. It consumed the goldsmiths' houses, and the intense heat of the blaze penetrated deep into the stone-lined vaults below. In the aftermath, it would be discovered that the inferno had been so hot that it had melted the stores of gold and silver, creating fused, glittering masses of metal, the wealth of a nation rendered into a useless, solidified puddle. The fire was not just destroying wealth, it was transmuting it into a monument of its own destructive power. The conflagration spread through the labyrinth of courts and alleys that housed the great livery company halls, the mercers, the drapers, the grocers, the haberdashers, the ancient guilds that had governed the city's trade for centuries. These were not just administrative buildings, they were repositories of history, filled with charters, records, priceless tapestries, and silver plate accumulated over generations. One by one, they were consumed. The fire erased their history, burning the vellum charters and the ancient minute books, wiping out the institutional memory of the city. Meanwhile, the general populace, seeing the fire now raging in the wealthiest part of the city, was seized by a new, more cynical kind of panic. The exodus of the previous day had been about saving lives and personal belongings. The panic of Monday was about plunder. A breakdown of law and order began to take hold. Crowds of the desperate and the opportunistic began to break into the houses and shops that lay in the fire's path, not to save the goods, but to steal them. The disaster was providing cover for a citywide looting spree. Authority had all but collapsed. It was in this atmosphere of financial ruin and social chaos that the king, Charles II, and his brother, James, Duke of York, finally took decisive control. Realizing the Lord Mayor was useless, they began to organize the Privy Council, mustering troops and personally riding into the city to oversee the firefighting efforts. But they were facing a beast that had been allowed a 36-hour head start. On Monday, the fire was king, and it was holding court in the ruins of London's burning treasure house. By Tuesday, the 4th of September, the fire had become a thing of mythic proportions, an entity that seemed to defy the laws of nature and man. It had raged for 2 full days and nights, and its appetite was insatiable. It had devoured the homes of the poor, the wharves of the merchants, and the counting houses of the bankers. Now, it raised its fiery gaze to the heavens and fixed upon the greatest structure in the city, the spiritual anchor of London for over 600 years, the old St. Paul's Cathedral. This was not the domed, classical masterpiece of Sir Christopher Wren that stands today. This was its medieval predecessor, a colossal Gothic giant, one of the largest churches in Christendom. Its central spire, long since destroyed by lightning, had once been the tallest in Europe. Its cavernous nave, known as Paul's Walk, was the city's main public square, a noisy, bustling thoroughfare where business was conducted, gossip was exchanged, and servants were hired. The cathedral was more than a house of God, it was the stone heart of London, a landmark that defined the skyline and the collective identity of its people. It was, everyone believed, indestructible. As the fire advanced westwards on Tuesday, this belief in St. Paul's invincibility turned the cathedral into a fatal sanctuary. Panicked citizens, seeing the flames consume everything made of wood and plaster, looked to its immense stone walls and saw salvation. They began to move their most precious belongings into the church, believing them to be safe there. The booksellers of nearby Paternoster Row, the centre of London's publishing trade, filled the cathedral's crypt, the Church of St. Faith, with their entire stock. Crates of books, stacks of paper, and priceless manuscripts were piled high in the subterranean vaults, entrusted to the cold, damp security of the ancient stone. The nave and aisles above were likewise filled with the rescued possessions of merchants and wealthy householders, chests of valuables, furniture, and bales of cloth. The cathedral was transformed into a massive storage locker, a fortress of last resort against the encroaching apocalypse. The fire arrived in the late morning. It came not as a single front, but as a pincer movement. Flames consumed the houses huddled against the cathedral's outer walls, while a blizzard of sparks and burning embers, carried on the wind, rained down upon its vast, timber-framed roof, which was covered in 6 acres of lead sheeting. For hours, the great church resisted. The stone walls stood firm, and the crowds watching from a distance allowed themselves a flicker of hope. But the cathedral had a fatal vulnerability. For years, it had been in a state of disrepair. In the 1630s, the great classical architect Inigo Jones had begun a major restoration, encasing parts of the old Gothic structure in a new stone facade. But the Civil War had interrupted the work, and for the past 2 decades, the cathedral had been surrounded by a forest of wooden scaffolding, left to rot by the cash-strapped government. This scaffolding, baked dry by the long summer, was the fire's entry point. It acted as a giant ladder of kindling, carrying the flames from the burning houses below right up to the eaves of the roof. Once the fire took hold of the ancient, dry roof timbers, the fate of St. Paul's was sealed. The heat inside the roof space became immense. The lead covering began to melt. At first, it glowed a dull red, then a brilliant, incandescent silver. Then it began to flow. Rivers of molten lead poured from the roof, cascading down the walls in fiery waterfalls and running through the streets in glowing, deadly streams. The sight was both terrifying and surreal, as if the very fabric of the building was weeping tears of liquid fire. The immense heat caused the stone of the cathedral to calcify and explode. Great chunks of masonry were propelled outwards like cannonballs, landing hundreds of feet away. The beautiful stained glass windows, including the great rose window at the east end, shattered into a million pieces. Inside, the fire dropped down into the nave, igniting the furniture and goods that had been stored there for safety. The books in the crypt below began to smolder, then burn, creating a vast, subterranean furnace that heated the flagstones above until they glowed red-hot. The pillars, the great stone trees that held up the roof, began to crack and buckle. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, with a deafening, grinding roar that was heard for miles, the entire roof of the vast cathedral collapsed into the nave, sending a volcano of sparks and flames erupting into the night sky. The fall of St. Paul's was the symbolic climax of the Great Fire. It was a moment of profound, soul-crushing despair. If the house of God himself could be so utterly annihilated, then everything was lost. The city had not just lost its greatest building, it had lost its soul. Sometime during the terrifying, ruinous night of Tuesday, as the embers of St. Paul's Cathedral painted the sky, a crucial shift occurred in the minds of the men now fighting the fire. The strategy of containment, of throwing meager buckets of water on an inferno, had been a catastrophic failure. The fire was not a force to be extinguished, it was an enemy to be starved. The king and his brother, the Duke of York, who had been tirelessly riding through the chaos, directing efforts and attempting to maintain some semblance of order, made a brutal but necessary decision. The only way to stop the fire's westward march was to create a void in its path, a firebreak so wide that not even the wind-driven flames could leap across it. The time for fire hooks and pulling down houses by hand was over. They needed a more powerful tool of demolition. They needed gunpowder. The decision was fraught with peril. It meant deliberately destroying swathes of the city that were not yet on fire, sacrificing hundreds of homes to save thousands. It was a terrifying gamble. The use of explosives in the heart of a crowded, panicked city was itself a massive risk. But desperation had forced their hand. James, the Duke of York, took command of this new, militarized phase of the battle. He commandeered sailors from the naval dockyards at Deptford and Woolwich, men who were experienced in the handling of gunpowder and accustomed to discipline and danger. These teams of sailors, their faces already blackened with soot, became the shock troops in the war against the fire. They were dispatched to key strategic locations, primarily in the west, towards the legal district of the Temple and the ultimate prize the fire sought, the royal palace of Whitehall itself. The process was violent and terrifying for the citizens who remained. The sailors would enter a street that lay in the fire's projected path, often with the flames only a few hundred yards away, roaring like a beast about to pounce. They would evacuate the houses, then lay charges of gunpowder in the cellars. A cry of warning would go up, a moment of tense silence, and then a deafening explosion would rock the ground. A house, a home that had stood for a century, would be obliterated in a flash, collapsing into a heap of splintered timber and dust. The sailors worked with a grim, methodical efficiency, blowing up house after house, creating a wide belt of rubble. The sound of these controlled demolitions added a new, percussive rhythm to the symphony of destruction, a counterpoint to the continuous roar of the approaching fire. It was the sound of humanity fighting back, using one form of destruction to combat another. The most critical of these firebreaks was established from the legal inns of the Temple, down towards the River Fleet, and northwards towards Holborn. Here, the Duke of York himself oversaw the operation, riding through the rubble, shouting orders, his figure a strange silhouette of authority against the backdrop of the blazing city. The lawyers of the Temple, initially resistant to the destruction of their ancient and beautiful buildings, were persuaded to help, forming their own brigades to assist the sailors. The fire, which had been advancing relentlessly on a 1.5 mile wide front, finally met a significant obstacle. It reached the edge of the demolished zones, and for the first time, it faltered. The flames, deprived of the closely packed houses that had been their fuel and their bridge, found only a wide expanse of broken stone and earth. They licked at the edges of the rubble, hungry and frustrated, but they could not make the leap. This strategy was not universally successful. In some areas, the demolitions were not wide enough, and the fire, aided by a ferocious gust of wind, still managed to jump the gap. In others, the explosions themselves inadvertently spread the fire by throwing flaming debris onto the roofs of houses that were supposed to have been saved. But in the grand scheme, the tactic worked. The advance of the fire was blunted. Its momentum, which had seemed so unstoppable, was finally broken. On Wednesday, the 5th of September, another factor turned in the city's favor. The wind, that constant, malevolent accomplice to the fire, finally died down. The great easterly that had fanned the flames for 4 days dwindled to a breeze, then to an almost dead calm. The combination of the extensive firebreaks and the change in the weather marked the turning point. The fire was not yet out, but it was contained. It was surrounded. The beast was cornered, and for the first time since that fateful spark in Pudding Lane, the exhausted, traumatized people of London could dare to hope that the end was in sight. The tide had turned, not through prayer or chance, but through brutal, calculated destruction. The city was being saved by being partially destroyed by its own defenders. By Wednesday evening, the great roar that had filled the air for 4 days and nights began to subside, replaced by an exhausted, crackling hiss. The fire, hemmed in by the vast, rubble-strewn firebreaks and no longer spurred on by the wind, had consumed everything it could reach. It had burned itself out. The immediate danger was over, but what was left was a scene of almost unimaginable desolation, a landscape from a nightmare. The sun on Thursday, the 6th of September, rose over not a city, but a ruin. Where once a bustling metropolis of 450,000 souls had stood, there was now a vast, smoking wound covering over 430 acres. The diarist John Evelyn, who ventured into the charred remains, described it as a vision of hell. The ground was still so hot that it scorched the soles of his shoes. The air was thick with a foul, steamy vapor, the smell of quenched fire and untold decay. The silence was profound, broken only by the groan of a collapsing wall or the whisper of the wind through the hollow shells of buildings. The scale of the destruction was staggering, almost beyond comprehension. Over 13,200 houses had been utterly destroyed, leaving nearly 100,000 people homeless, a population roughly the size of England's next 5 largest cities combined. 87 parish churches, the spiritual centers of their communities, were now gutted, roofless specters. The great halls of 44 livery companies, the seats of the city's ancient guilds, were gone. The Royal Exchange, the Custom House, the Sessions House, the city's 3 main gates, Aldersgate, Newgate, and Ludgate, and the notorious Newgate prison had all been reduced to rubble. And at the heart of the devastation stood the skeletal remains of St. Paul's Cathedral, its massive stone pillars cracked and broken, its vast nave open to the sky, a monument to the totality of the disaster. The very geography of the city had been erased. The familiar network of streets, lanes, and alleys had vanished under a uniform blanket of ash and debris, several feet deep in places. London had been returned to a primal state, a smoldering, monochromatic wasteland. For days, the ruins continued to burn. Cellars packed with coal or spirits would suddenly erupt in flames, sending jets of fire shooting up from the ground. The rubble of St. Paul's smoldered for months. The immediate aftermath was a period of dislocation and shock. The hundreds of thousands of refugees camped in the fields surrounding the city, in Moorfields, Finsbury, and on the south bank at St. George's Fields, found themselves in a desperate situation. They were without food, shelter, or sanitation. The king and his council acted swiftly to prevent a humanitarian crisis and potential civil unrest. They ordered naval biscuit to be distributed from the royal stores and established official markets where bread could be sold at a fixed price, preventing the price gouging that had begun to take hold. Proclamations were issued encouraging the towns and villages around London to offer aid and shelter to the homeless. But for the individuals and families huddled in the fields, the future was a terrifying blank. They had lost everything. They possessed only the clothes they stood in and the few pathetic belongings they had managed to drag from the flames. They would sit for hours, simply staring at the smoking void where their lives had been. Slowly, cautiously, people began to venture back into the dead city. They picked their way through the hot ashes, searching for the sites of their former homes, often unable to recognize the very streets they had lived on their entire lives. They dug through the debris, hoping to find something, anything, of value. In the cellars of the houses, some found their strongboxes had survived, their contents intact. But for most, there was nothing. The fire had been absolute in its consumption. The official death toll of the fire was remarkably, almost unbelievably, low, officially recorded in single digits. This number is almost certainly a gross underestimation. It failed to account for the poor, the unregistered, and those who were simply incinerated without a trace, their bodies turned to ash and mixed indistinguishably with the ruins of their homes. The true human cost will never be known, but the psychological cost was immeasurable. London was a city in a collective state of shock, a community grieving for a world that had vanished in a storm of fire. The immediate aftermath was not a time of rebuilding, but of quiet, stunned contemplation of the void. In the cold, gray ashes of the ruined city, something ugly and dangerous began to stir. A disaster of this magnitude was incomprehensible, an act of such overwhelming violence that it seemed to defy rational explanation. For a populace already steeped in paranoia and conditioned by war and religious strife, the idea that the fire was a simple, tragic accident was unsatisfying, almost insulting to the scale of the loss. There had to be an author. There had to be a plot. And so, the search for scapegoats began. The deep-seated xenophobia that simmered beneath the surface of English society erupted with ferocious intensity. The enemy, it was decided, had to be from without. Suspicion immediately fell upon England's declared enemies, the Dutch, and their allies, the French. Rumors, as fast and destructive as the fire itself, swept through the refugee camps and the surviving parts of the city. It was whispered that foreign agents had been seen throwing fireballs into houses, that gangs of Frenchmen and Dutchmen had been caught with pockets full of combustible materials. This mass hysteria quickly escalated into violence. Any person with a foreign accent or appearance was in mortal danger. Mobs roamed the streets, seizing anyone they suspected of being a foreigner. A French blacksmith was attacked and almost dismembered before being rescued by guards. A Swedish diplomat was dragged from his carriage and would have been lynched if not for the intervention of a prominent nobleman. The paranoia was so intense that even an innocent letter found on the street, written in a foreign language, was enough to incite a riot. The government, fearing a complete breakdown of order, was forced to issue proclamations insisting on the foreigners' innocence and to house many of them in protective custody for their own safety. The need for a villain was so powerful that it created its own evidence, turning fear into fact in the minds of a traumatized people. The fire had destroyed the city's buildings, now, paranoia was threatening to destroy its social fabric. Into this feverish atmosphere stepped a man named Robert Hubert. He was a 26-year-old French watchmaker from Rouen, a simple, possibly mentally disabled man who had been in London for only 2 days, having arrived by ship from Sweden. Seized by a mob, Hubert made a startling confession. He claimed that he had started the fire. He said he was an agent of the Pope and had acted on the orders of a man named Paid, who had promised him a reward. He claimed to have thrown a fireball through the window of the bakery on Pudding Lane. His confession was a confused and contradictory mess. He initially claimed to have started the fire in Westminster, an area the fire never even reached. When told the fire started at a bakery in Pudding Lane, he promptly changed his story to match. He described the device he used and the location with a strange, unnerving certainty. For the authorities and the public, it was the confession they had been desperate to hear. Here was the culprit, the tangible cause of all their suffering. The trial of Robert Hubert was a formality. The evidence against him was non-existent, aside from his own increasingly elaborate and unbelievable confession. The captain of the ship he had arrived on testified that Hubert had not even landed in London until 2 days after the fire began, making it physically impossible for him to have been in Pudding Lane. The owner of the bakery, Thomas Fariner, testified that his bakery had no window, only a small peephole, making Hubert's story of throwing a fireball through it impossible. But none of this mattered. The court, and the public, wanted a conviction. The Lord Chief Justice himself, who presided over the trial, later admitted that he did not believe a word of Hubert's testimony but that the jury and the mood of the city made an acquittal impossible. Hubert was found guilty. On the 27th of October, 1666, he was taken to Tyburn, the site of public executions, and hanged. After his death, it was discovered that he was not even a Catholic, but a French Protestant, a Huguenot. His confession was the product of a disturbed mind, a desperate and pathetic attempt to claim importance in a world that had overlooked him. He was a victim of the fire as surely as the maidservant who died in Farriner's house, a sacrifice to the city's desperate need for blame. The execution of Robert Hubert was the final, tragic act of the Great Fire, a judicial murder that laid a dark stain on the city's recovery, a somber testament to the fact that when societies are broken by disaster, they often seek to heal themselves by an act of injustice. From the ashes, a new city had to rise. The fire, in its absolute destruction, had created a blank slate, a unique and unprecedented opportunity to reimagine and rebuild London on a grander, safer, and more rational scale. In the immediate aftermath, a wave of intellectual and architectural ambition swept through the minds of England's greatest thinkers. Men like the brilliant scientist Robert Hooke, the learned diarist John Evelyn, and the King's Surveyor of Works, a young, ambitious architect named Christopher Wren, saw a chance to create a modern utopia from the ruins of the medieval labyrinth. They rushed to draw up magnificent plans for a new London. Their designs featured wide, straight boulevards in the continental style of Paris or Rome, great public squares, and a rational, orderly grid of streets. Wren's plan was particularly breathtaking, a Baroque vision of piazzas and radial avenues culminating in a new, grander Royal Exchange and a majestic, domed St. Paul's Cathedral. These were not mere blueprints, they were expressions of a new, optimistic, scientific age, a belief that reason and order could triumph over chaos. However, the beautiful dreams of the architects quickly collided with the messy, intractable realities of property and commerce. London was not an empty plot of land. The ground beneath the ashes was a complex, invisible web of property rights, leaseholds, and ancient titles. Every citizen, from the wealthiest merchant to the humblest shopkeeper, owned the footprint of their destroyed home, and they were desperate to rebuild and restart their lives and businesses as quickly as possible. The legal and financial challenge of compensating every single property owner and redrawing thousands of individual plots was simply too vast, too expensive, and too slow for a city in a state of emergency. Pragmatism, therefore, won out over vision. The king, despite his initial enthusiasm for the grand schemes, decreed that the city would largely be rebuilt upon its old foundations and its ancient street plan. The dream of a London of broad avenues was abandoned. The new city would retain the medieval soul of the old. But this was not to say that nothing changed. The Rebuilding Act of 1667 was a landmark piece of legislation that would fundamentally and permanently alter the character of the city. Its primary, overriding concern was fire. The act decreed that all new houses were to be built of brick or stone, not wood. The flammable, overhanging timber jetties were outlawed. The types of houses were standardized into 4 classes, their heights and wall thicknesses regulated according to the importance of the street they stood on. Roofs were to be covered with slate or tile, not combustible thatch. The act was a revolution in urban planning, the first comprehensive building code in London's history. It was a direct, pragmatic response to the trauma of the fire, an attempt to engineer resilience into the very fabric of the new city. The result was the London we can still see traces of today, a city of sober, handsome brick terraces, a city of greater uniformity, light and air, a city built not for picturesque medieval charm, but for durability and safety. And at the heart of this resurrection stood Christopher Wren. Though his grand city plan was rejected, he was given the monumental task of rebuilding the city's churches. He would personally design and oversee the construction of 51 new parish churches, each a unique masterpiece of Baroque ingenuity and elegance. And, of course, he would build his magnum opus, the new St. Paul's Cathedral. For 35 years, he labored to raise his great dome over the city, a symbol of rebirth and resilience that would come to define the London skyline for centuries. The new London that rose from the ashes was also a city of new ideas. The immense financial losses spurred the development of a new industry, fire insurance. In 1680, the first insurance company, the Fire Office, was established by Nicholas Barbon, one of the primary developers of the new city. For the first time, property owners could pay a premium to protect themselves against the financial risk of fire, a concept that would become a cornerstone of the modern economy. The Great Fire, then, was not merely an ending. It was a violent and traumatic beginning. It was a baptism by fire that purged the city of its medieval squalor and its plague-ridden past. It acted as a brutal catalyst, accelerating London's transformation into a modern, commercial, and imperial capital. The fire destroyed a city of wood and faith, and from its embers, there arose a new city of brick, reason, and capital. The scar it left on the landscape eventually healed, but the scar it left on the city's consciousness, the deep, abiding memory of the wind, the heat, and the roar, would remain forever. It became London's defining myth, a permanent reminder of its own fragility and its remarkable capacity for renewal.